won't go see Jasper?
Hi, Shabby. Hey, sweetie. What you doing? Yeah? Oh, say hi to YouTube, Shabby. Yeah, hi, YouTube. Up, Tubbs. What you doing, Tubbs? Want to say hi to YouTubes? Say hi to YouTube, Tubbs. Yeah. Okay. There's our big boy. Hello, Smokes. What's up, buddy? You hanging out at the new shop? Yeah? Got the little sunshine, buddy? Yeah. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to start the blower teardown and rebuild. All right, here's what we got. We got, you guys remember this? Took this old blower out. This thing's all rusty and seized up. Hey, Jenny. Say hi. Twinks is gonna help me film this one up. We're gonna do this one in a 3-part series. It's going to be, or maybe 2 parts. It's gonna be tear down and disassembly, and then cleaning, reassembly, and timing. We may do that last part in a couple of videos, or we just may make it in one video. But basically, what we're gonna be doing is ripping one of these things apart, getting it all cleaned up, and then putting it all back together, and it'll have it so that we can throw it on another trailer if we need to. So we got the new shop all cleaned up and everything's put away, and we're rocking and rolling. I'm pretty stoked. This place is awesome. Another little looky-loo around. We've been keeping the trucks inside, which I don't really want to do, but it gets pretty lively here at night. And fucking Washington decided to basically hamstring the cops, so the cops really can't do anything anymore because of some new laws that passed. So what I'm basically saying is that we can't keep anything outside at night because people will just come fucking... That truck right there has been broken into twice in the last month. Yeah. Weird times. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get to it. So what we're gonna do is start today just by taking this thing apart and get it ready for cleaning. Now the proper way to do this is to take this thing all apart and then sandblast it and then put it back together, time it, make any adjustments that are necessary. Then once you get it all back together, then actually paint it. I'm actually probably gonna sandblast it. Usually I can do it, there's a couple of different ways you can clean off the parts. What I've always done in the past is use like a wire wheel, but we're actually gonna sandblast this one this time. So, but we'll make that a different part. But here's what you need to do this work. You need some digital calipers. Just a little, they don't have to be digital, but the digital ones are nice. With metric and standard options for looking at stuff. You need a seal installation kit, and you actually don't need this either. You can get by without this. You need a set of long feeler gauges with an assortment of different measuring gauges. But these are essentially just like a little short one, but you need these ones to be able to reach down inside this blower to grab the measurements. And you can get these from Napa for like, I don't know, 30 bucks or something like that, whatever they are. But you need a set of long feeler gauges. You need a puller bar with an assortment of bolts, and then you need some oil to refill the gear end. Now, what you actually need to do this is this bar puller. The rest of this operation complete, if you have a blower that's already assembled and you could get by without the feeler gauges, the seal installation tool, or the caliper, but we're gonna use all this to show you guys the proper way to reset the clearances. But in a crunch, if you had to, you could actually probably get one of these things apart, cleaned up, and working again with just that, and a few sockets and stuff like that. All right, we'll get back to this show. Okay, guys, here's how we're gonna proceed. Are you going?
Yep.
Go. All right, so we got these 4005s. They're plumbed with 2.5-inch pipe thread. So that's what that is. It's a 2.5-inch fitting. And what I do is I use these. You can buy these from any plumbing supply store. It's just a little short chunk of pipe that's got 2.5-inch pipe thread on it. Tape off the ends. This keeps dust out of the inside. We're gonna take these off. set these aside. I'll come up here and have a look what's going on inside this thing and why we have to rebuild this thing. Okay, these lobes in here are just totally gummed up. And they're just caked with rust and oil and grease and just hardened schmutz. But what we got here, this is the drive shaft. You can see this thing's just seized up. Got a couple of grease fittings and some grease fitting pressure relief valves underneath here. Dust cover seal. We got the end caps and the gear coil. Come over on this side. So first thing we gotta do is we're gonna take out all these plugs. And these things are designed to be able to sit in any orientation. So we could take these feet off here and mount them on the ends, on the top, and you could rotate this thing and run it in any orientation. So they got these oil drain plugs and sight window all over the oil gear cover housing. And all these gotta come out. And then we gotta zip out these side bolts, split this whole thing apart. And it's quite a process getting these things apart. And, but we're gonna start by draining the oil. So we're gonna just go whatever plug is on the bottom here and work this puppy out. And get the oil out of this thing. Now these things hold a freakishly small amount of oil. It's like a few ounces. So it doesn't take much to drain these things out. Uses like a quarter of a quart, and it's just enough to get the gears wet inside this housing. And they use some kind of funky synthetic oil. But while this is draining, I'm just gonna go ahead and take all these plugs out and the sight windows and basically strip this housing down, get all the fittings out of it while the oil's draining. Now you're gonna need to get some seals and possibly some new bearings for one of these things when you rebuild it. Because pressure washing tends to kind of gum up the housings pretty quickly, you wind up not really needing to do the bearings usually. The bearings will still be in really good shape because these things, you know, the bearings are super beefy, really strong hunks of metal. And these things tend to gum up long before the bearings need to be replaced. So what I'm gonna do with this one, on this rebuild, is try to save and reuse the bearings because they're not expensive, but they're not cheap. It's like a new set of bearings for these is probably a couple $100, but we're not gonna need them on this one. So we're gonna reuse the bearings. We won't be able to save the seals though. Now, where do you get all this stuff? A couple of you guys have talked about not being able to find parts of these things, and that is true. They're actually really easy to get a hold of. So up in this area, we use a company called Northwest Industrial Repair, and they'll ship anywhere in the country. But basically what you need to do is just kind of get on Google, and in your local area, if you want to use someplace close, just find a shop that does industrial repair for roots blowers and air pumps. And those guys will have the connections with the manufacturers of these things to be able to order the parts for them. And you basically just look on the sticker, tell them what model number you have, and they'll order you up seals, bearings, dust covers, any kind of fittings or any part you need for these things. They'll be able to get those for you. And they're actually pretty reasonable. So a seal kit without the bearings to rebuild this thing is, I think it's $188. And we got one on the way. Jeff Swanson from Northwest Industrial Repair is got these things ordered for us. So we're not gonna be able to do the whole thing today. We'll have to wait for the kit to come in. So we got all the plugs out. And step one is we are going to be taking off the gear cover, which is the part of this thing that holds the oil. So the first thing we're going to be doing is taking off this cover right here, which houses the gears and holds the oil. That'll be step one. but I'm going to go ahead and finish taking out all the grease fittings. Basically get all the parts broken down on the outside. So over here, it's got a couple of grease zerks, and then on the bottom, we've got a couple of grease pressure relief fittings. They're sort of like grease zerks, but what they do is when they get over pressurized, they let grease squirt out. So get these two little fittings out, and then the two underneath. You can go ahead and cut that.
Action.
Okay, so we got all the, let me have a look here. We just got a bunch of 3/8 plugs. These go in the gear housing, or the gear cover. A couple of breather valve, just a plug with a hole in it. Sight window, oil sight glass, and some grease zerks. What I like to do is put all these little parts in the gear cover once I get it off. So, this one's got some hex head bolts on it. Sometimes they'll just use like 9/16 head size or 3/8 standard thread, whatever kind of bolt yours uses. So if we're taking off the gear cover first, we need, looks like 3/16, if I remember right, or 7/32. Now these gear covers are put on with a layer of silicone. So to get these things off, all you need to do is grab some kind of a mallet, not metal, rubber mallet, brass mallet, something. Get this thing some taps, and all we're just trying to do is break that silicone gasket. Try a different one. So you can see the little silicone gasket material, silicone RTV. So now we can see our gears exposed. This is what times these blowers. I'll show you all that later. So I'm just going to take all these screws and fittings and just put them in here. It's a good place to keep them. All these parts are going to go in the blasting cabinet. Get cleaned up, get all the old paint, all the old mud and schmutz off of them. And once we get this thing back together, we'll get it repainted. Okay, so before we go any further, what we got to do is we got to get these gears off so that we can get these end plates apart. The gears are going to trap this end plate, and these things can be real difficult to get off. And these bolts right here are torqued down pretty hard. I think that might be the easiest I've ever had one of those come off. These little impact guns make it nice. That's all right. Put a breaker bar on it. And all we got there is a beveled thick steel washer and a really strong flange nut. Okay, now this is where it gets a little tricky, but it's not hard to do. It's a little time consuming. Now you got to get in close to see what I'm talking about here. Now, as these gears come off, they're gonna want to rotate relative to one another because the gears are cut helical, and this is the method by which you time these things. But what can't happen when they're seized up is you can't just pull a gear off, because what'll happen is these teeth are going to start interfering with each other, and they're just going to get stuck unless this one also has the ability to rotate freely. If they don't, if the blower's seized up and you're trying to get these gears off, what's going to have to happen is you're gonna have to take both of these gears off basically at the same time. You got a couple of thousandths of leeway to play with here, but what we'll do basically is we're gonna put the puller on this thing, install the puller, and pull this gear out a little bit. And then it's gonna bind up with this gear, which can't rotate because it's all gummed up. And then we're gonna remove the puller, put on this one, back this one off, and get those gears unbound. And we're just gonna repeat that process back and forth, back and forth, back and forth until we get these things fully enough out that we can just pop them off. But it's gonna be a little bit of a pain. But I'll show you how to do this. So what we're going to do first is find out which of these stud holes, which bolt we need for these stud holes to mount the puller. I can never remember which ones it is. I think it's that. That's not it. That one maybe? That's standard thread, so we need some sort of fine thread option here. Go. Those are the ones. Now the easiest thing to do would be to install two of these and just move your impact gun back and forth, but we've only got one, so we're going to have to disassemble and reassemble this puller situation until we get them both all the way off. Now, when you're putting these pullers on, you want these two bolts to be screwed in to the same depth. So what we're going to do to kind of check that is we're going to look on the back side of the gear, and then we'll see when the bolt starts to protrude through the gear, and we'll just have it be flush on the back side. That way we know we got an even amount of depth, and that this flange surface is going to be basically parallel to the surface of this gear. What we don't want to have happen is have this flange kind of be pulling at an angle. We want it to be pulling straight back, which means these bolts got to be set to the same depth. So all I'm going to do is just screw these in until I see them protrude through, and just put them both basically be flush. There you go. Okay, so these two bolts now are both set to the same depth. Now what I'm going to do is tighten up my puller Put a little tension on these gears. Switch over my socket to, I think that's 11/16. Now to pull this gear out, I'm gonna have to drive this nut in relative to this flange. So what I'm gonna do is just put a little bit on it until I start feeling like it's binding up. And it's gonna be a couple of turns, not very much at all. And I'll be able to see right here, when this gear starts coming out a little bit, I'll be able to see it start to pull out relative to this gear. I'll feel a little ridge there. And I can already tell these things are real tight, so what we're going to do is we're going to oil up the threads on this puller so that we don't totally strip it out. I'll just grab some of the gear oil that we took out of this case and just lubricate these threads. There we go. This will help this process out quite a bit. Putting some oil on those threads. That's stopped, so I got a feeling we're bumping into some gear interference, and now we're going to switch sides. Long and tedious. Go ahead and get a shot behind this gear, Jenny.
Okay.
Put the camera right behind that gear so you can see that bolt right behind here. No, behind here. There you go. Okay, I want you to look back there when this bolt starts protruding through. That's what I'm doing. Okay, what I'm going to do is just back that off until it's flush with the back of that gear. That's what I mean when I say getting these things set to an even depth. There we go. On this one. There we go. Hope you guys can see that. All right. Now we're going to put a little pulling pressure on this side. Okay, come over here. I want you to look real closely right here. Where those two gears, you're going to see that gear come out a little bit. See that? It's going to start interfering pretty soon, so what I'm going to do is stop and then switch over again. So now those teeth are starting to hit and they're like at an angle. So since they're coming at an angle, what's happening is they're kind of trying to do that and they just won't pull apart. So what we need to do is kind of take that pressure off and then back the other side out and just back these things out evenly so that the teeth stay more or less not interfering with each other. And it's just a process of going back and forth until you get it. back the pressure off of that. Zip these two out again. Now you don't have to do this if your lobes are able to rotate. Like if your blower's not all bound up, you don't have to do this back and forth process, because what you could do is you could just, right before they start to bind up, you can just rotate that gear a little bit, and then you can pull this one out, rotate a little more, pull it out. But the reason why we're doing this is because they're bound up and seized up. Since the lobes cannot move inside the housing and those gears can't rotate, that is why we have to go through all this extra trouble to go back and forth and back and forth. But we'll get it. It'll just be a little bit of time. Again, setting our bolt depth. Count up nice and even. Okay, now watch closely between these two gears. Now what's going to happen is this one is going to come out relative to that one. Now it's going to start binding up a little bit. And as soon as I see that thing bumping into any kind of resistance, I basically stop right there. One or two more cycles per side and we'll have this thing, these gears off. Okay, ready for another extraction. Push. Okay, Jenny, come over here. Keep an eye on the relationship of the depth of these two gears. That's about as far as we're going to get on that one. Okay, ready to pull this one out a little bit more? So now if you were to get the instructions for these blowers, when you buy one of these things, you get an owner's manual with them that tells you how to do all this. They're going to tell you, they're going to tell you that you're going to want to mark these gears. You actually don't have to do that. The reason why you don't is because it's really easy, if you don't have the mark on the gears, to figure out where they were. But if you want, the way I like to do it is I'm putting back together is you see the keyway for the gear there? There's one here and one here. These keyways are essentially, they meet it exactly 90 degrees. When they machine these lobes, they make it so that the keyways are essentially coming in at a 90-degree angle. So it's easy to find the exact tooth and get it to work right. But if you're worried about that, or you feel like, oh, that's going to be too much trouble, just grab a marker or a Sharpie or like an oil pen and just mark which gear is meshing up with which trough of gear. Give it a mark. And that way when you're putting them back together, you just got to line up those two exact teeth and you're good to go. Might be enough there. Now the further you get these gears off of the shaft, the more room you have to do like a bigger pull per side. So the amount of slop you have to work with goes up the farther out that gear is on the shaft. So you saw in the beginning I was just pulling off like maybe a couple of millimeters at a time, and then now I'm zipping them out, like pulling them out a good ½ inch or so at a time before we finally get them all the way off that shaft. See, this gear is actually spinning a little bit inside the housing. That's probably good enough. Any more and I might start wrecking metal. So it's important when you're getting to this point to not get lazy and try to take it off too far. You see it moving, but once those teeth bind up too hard, they're really difficult to get apart. You gotta basically pound one of them back in to get the pressure off those teeth, and it's just best to just kind of take the time and take a smaller bite of the extraction. So this gear is almost off. Could probably finagle it off of there, but I'm liable to get it stuck if I try, so I'm just gonna go ahead and pull this other one off before I try to get the last little bit off. And if you destroy these gears, and if you don't do this, if you're not careful, it's like $400 or $500 to replace them. And you start getting real close to the point where it just makes more sense to buy a new blower by the time you get through with all your time and energy. So, but if you get through it without damaging them, it's definitely worth it to do it yourself. And you know, you may not have another choice when you're just starting out in business and you don't have a lot of extra capital to throw away at repairs and maintenance. So this is the last pull right here. We're going to get this thing off on this go. Here we go. They're both off. Now we got a shaft key come out. Don't want to lose those. And we got some shims back there that need to come off too. So on this one, there's a spacer and a handful of shims and a shaft key. I'll show you what all these parts are so you don't lose them. So we're done with our puller. We can put this thing away. Okay, so we got the gears off. Now we got a left gear and a right gear. These gears are not identical, so you need to keep them separated. Come here. Look straight on like this. Okay, so we got a gear with a keyway and a gear with a keyway. And you can see that the extraction threaded holes they use to pull these things off, one set of these holes is sort of lined up with that keyway, and the other one seems to be off a few degrees. Essentially, these gears go together at 90 degrees. So if we were to sort of eyeball this shaft key and we turn this one 90 degrees, they basically go like that. That's how these things are going to go back together. But for now, what we're going to do, take these two gears, maintaining left and right, and just put them right in the housing, let them sit in there. That way they're still left and right, we know which is which. Now we're going to pull these shaft keys out and just tap these out. Chuck those in the box. Now we got some shims. Now these things you definitely don't want to get mixed up, and this is where your micrometer comes in. So what I like to do, so over here we got, looks like we got 4 shims on that side, and we got two shims on this side, and then we got a couple of spacers. The spacers are important because these things are not going to be exactly perfect. So we're going to make sure we keep the left one on the left side, the right one on the right side, and we're going to keep all the shims that were on the left side with the left side gear, and all the shims on the right side with the right side gear. So the combination of these shims and this spacer and the imperfections on the surface of that gear are what determine how to time these things. So for now, all that's important to remember is to keep these things compartmentalized the way they came off, and I'll show you how to sort all that out later. Now what's got to happen, now that the gears are off, this thing's ready to basically fully come apart. We got to take these little keeper rings. There's these like flat bearing keeper plate. They just zip right out with a little Allen bolt. That's that one. Here we go. These things aren't critical. You can mix these bolts up. Those in our box and our plate. We should also keep these things separated left and right because there's a certain amount of thickness to that imperfectly machined piece of metal. So if we don't want to reshim it and we just want to go with the old settings, we can just put everything back the way it was. And more than likely, when we check it with the feeler gauges, check the clearances with the feeler gauges, they'll be enough to make this thing run without the lobes hitting and causing massive problems. Okay, now that we've got all the timing and drive stuff out of the way, we're ready to pop these end covers off and get this thing split apart. Now the way you do this is, you'll see some holes over here where, oh, this one doesn't have it. Usually these things have a couple of jacking holes. And what you'll do is take, oh yeah, here they are on this side. So these things are kind of like, they're not press fit or there's not any kind of interference fit, but it is hard with the gearing and the seals, or sorry, with the bearings and the seals. They hold these shafts perfectly straight. So we're not going to be able to just pull these bolts out and pull this cover off, but they give you jacking holes. So what you do is take one of these bolts out, zip them all the way out, and then you got a jacking hole here and you got a jacking hole there. You just take this bolt, screw it into there, and then it'll push on this and force that end cap off. And then once you get this one off, then you can just, this one's a lot easier to come off. So we'll pull off, pull all the housing bolts out first. I think it's like 5/16 or 8mm on these ones. Yeah. So here's a little word to the wise here. When you come into like stiff bolts like this, your instinct is to go ahead and put like a breaker bar on these things and then just put a pressure, but that's problematic. That's how you break bolts. Before I do anything like try to put a bunch of heat on it, which would totally make it come out, just put a breaker bar on it, and then you want to simulate what an impact gun does, which is not put hard, steady pressure with your arm or something like that. Just give it a tap with a hammer and break it. You want a nice sharp spike in torque, and you want that, the torque applied to that bolt, you want it putting pressure on that bolt for the shortest amount of time possible. That just means hitting it instead of putting a lot of pressure. That's how you break these soft bolts. So there we go. And what I'll do is I'll just go around and zip any out that'll come out nice and easy. And then any ones that are left, I'll go ahead and put a hammer on. Stuck. They're probably all stuck. So we'll just go ahead and hammer them all. Or you can use a more powerful impact gun. That works too. So the torque I put on these bolts the last time I rebuilt it is just a little more than this little tiny 12-volt gun can put back on them. But if I take all the hoo-hoo off of it, then I can use the gun to zip all these out much quicker. Now these bolts down here that are holding the feet on, I'm going to loosen them up, but I'm not going to break them off all the way. other side.
The puppies.
That one came. Now I'm leaving the two on the bottom that are holding the mounting feet on, and I'll show you what we're going to do to deal with that. Because this thing's heavy and it's got to be supported while we're taking it apart. And when you take these things apart, what you need to do is take apart the dry end first. Now what I'll do is tip this thing up, pull these last two out that are holding on the mounting feet. Like so. Tip this thing back down at an angle. Rock it up like that. Nice. Okay. Almost there. Now what we need to do is we need to set this thing up on its side, but that kind of poses a problem because we got the two shaft ends sticking out. So I think what I've done before that looks pretty good is we just want to get a couple of blocks of wood and set them under here, and then set this thing up on it to kind of support it. I think I got some over here, maybe. Blocks works pretty good, and it's best to use wood and not metal stock. And if you do use metal, just put some rags or something so you protect that surface right there. This is a machine surface that is going to hold an oil seal, so what you don't want to do is scratch up this surface or that surface. So better to use wood to rest on that. That's what we want. These two shafts kind of sticking out underneath there on the bottom, and then this thing supported. So now we're just going to take two of our bolts up here, Jenny. Now these are the untapped holes that go into tapped holes in the housing. And so now we have a tapped hole in the cover and no tapped hole in the housing. So what will happen is we screw this down, it's going to push that cover away from the housing. You got two jacking points here and here. And then you got a couple of alignment dowels. And I can already see a problem. These jacking holes are just got a bunch of crap stuck in them. So what I'm gonna do is just take an air compressor hose to them real quick. Spray a little WD-40 in them, because what I don't wanna do is screw up those plate holes. So we'll screw a couple of our studs into the jacking holes, and we're essentially going to jack this cover away from that housing just by putting a little bit of pressure on this one. A little bit of even pressure on both sides. Now, not all these bolts are the same. There are some that are longer. 4 of these are going to be longer because they have to account for the added distance of screwing on these floor plate, feet plate. So grab the longer ones. You'll be able to get a little more jacking distance. And what we're doing is we're fighting the pressure of the bearing inside this bearing housing as it's grabbing the shafts that are passing through this housing. So we're basically, you know, those bearings are pretty tight fit. So it's hard to get those bearings to slide off of those shafts. There's a shaft end here and one here, and you can see that we're just relying on mechanical power to kind of do this slowly without marring up the shafts and causing a problem that's going to cause these things to not work when we put them back together. And what I'm paying attention to is the gap on this side right here and this right here. What I don't want to do is get these things too far apart. I don't want to have a big gap here and no gap over here, because what's happening is it's putting a lot of horizontal torque on those bearings and kind of twisting and bending the shafts. We don't want to do that. A little bit of pressure. Keep that gap basically the same, just a little bit both sides. Now that we're out of bolt length, that felt pretty loose, like that cover just dropped right back on over those bearings. So I think we'll be able to just wiggle this thing off now. Let's see how this goes. No. Okay, we'll pull it back out. We'll leave these all the way in. Let's try. We could do some prying, but what I really don't want to do is scratch up those mating surfaces at all. So I'll just see if we can't finagle this thing a little bit. Get it off of there. And then slide this out. Yeah, it's on there pretty tight. So what I'm going to do is put a screwdriver in there with a towel on it so I don't scratch up the surfaces. Give that thing some wiggles. Just going to use this towel to give a little marring protection. Put a little pry pressure on here. And if this doesn't work, what I can do is just grab some longer bolts that have the same thread and just jack these things all the way off, which is probably what I'm going to wind up doing. Yeah, you know what? That's going to be the move. So what I'm going to do is go back to my little puller kit, find some bolts that have matching thread, and then do it that way. Go ahead and kill it. Okay guys, these ones are tapped with just standard 3/8 by 16. This is like the kind of bolt that takes a 9/16 wrench, standard bolt from Home Depot. That's what this takes. So I got some longer ones. We can screw these in. We'll just pull this cover off the easy way. There we go. Okay, so what we got here is we got some seals on this side and bearings on that side. We'll get into that later. What we're gonna do now, carefully set that down. So let's have a look in here. See the rotors? The lobes are just totally gummed up with all kinds of shit. They're basically just getting stuck. You can see that right there. All that shit. That's what's stopping these things from rotating. We're gonna get this all down to bare clean metal. Get it put back together. Ready to rock. Okay, now what we gotta do is get this side off. And you know, I think the easiest way to do this side, oh, I left one in. is to just pull the lobes right out of the housing and then just tap those individual lobes out one by one. But I left one bolt in on accident. Right there. There we go. Okay, now what can happen is, yeah, let me stop making a mess. It's going to go and pull those lobes right out of that whole housing. This little tap here. So we got these dowels right there. So I think what I'll do, we'll take that guy, give this thing some tacks back here. What I'm going to do is hit the rotors, hit the ends of the rotors. So we see the housing coming apart a little bit. That's good. And this thing's ready to come apart. I think what I'll do is just see if I can lift this right off. There we go. Okay. That's done. That's what's the housing. Super simple. But as you can see, really dirty. All that shit causing us some problems. That's cool. It's going in the sandblaster. Okay, now what we got to do is get these lobes out of these bearings. Now the bearings are kind of stuck in the housing, the lobes are stuck in the middle of the bearing. So I found the easiest way to do this is to basically set this thing up like, well, there's a couple ways you could do this. I think what I'll do is I'm just going to balance the lobes on a block and then pound the cover off of the lobes. So what I'm doing is these bearings are stuck on these shafts. So what I can do is just set this up on the ends of these shafts. Now I can just tap here and here and start working this thing down off of those bearings. And this is not happy doing it this way, so I think maybe probably going to wind up putting the jaw puller on this thing. We're going to push these things out with some mechanical pressure. So I'm going to get all this set up, get the puller set up into push mode, and then we'll see what we can do with this. Okay, go ahead. Here's the challenge trying to save these bearings. Normally you would stick a punch on the other side and just pop these things out. But you can mar up the bearing raceways if you're not careful. So what I'm going to do, since this housing is constructed the way, you got to get the camera in here so these guys can see this. If you look down in here, the bearing is kind of like in a little housing about like this, but there's like this sort of metal thing, and you can only get to the inside of the bearing. So what I'm going to use is a brass punch. Now the brass is much softer than the steel. I can kind of get on the steel at an angle like this, and what will happen is the brass is going to deform before I scratch up that steel. So don't do this if you're trying to save your bearings with a steel punch, because you'll wind up just destroying the bearings anyways. So what I'm going to do is just tap on both sides of this inner race and just try to work that bearing out until I get them both out. And then once I get the bearing out, then I can just dig the seal out that's right behind it. And I can feel that thing moving a little bit. So that's good. Yeah, this thing's coming out nicely. We're not hurting that bearing at all. Okay, bearing 1 is out. So it's just little taps, and the main goal is to not deform the metal on those bearings at all. And just let this head of this brass punch take all of the beating. You can see it's getting all marred up, but that's what we want. Something's got to give, but we want it to be the brass punch and not the bearings. Okay, that one's out. Now what we got left is the seals. You can see the seals in there. And these things are much easier to get out. And literally just put that punch anywhere on that seal and just knock it right out of there. Now, these things will get destroyed. There's no way to save them unless you were to leave them in. But then you risk not having a good seal. So at the minimum, you should always redo the seals. Okay, seal 1 is out. Seal 2 is out. So there's the seals, totally destroyed, getting them out of there. No way to avoid that. That one's good. That's down to bare metal, ready to get sandblasted.
Yeah.
So we'll set that right there. Get to work on this one here. So now on this one, we got seal, bearing, seal. On this side, we got seal underneath, bearing, dust cover. So we're gonna get this dust cover off of here first. And the dust covers usually can't be saved. So I always like to order a new one of those. And they're cheap, they're like $3 or something. Another way to get this dust cover off is when you take out those grease fittings in the very beginning, just put an air hose on the threaded hole where the grease fitting screws into, just blast with a little bit of air pressure, and that dust cover will pop right out. That's another way to get those out of there. So for the idling end of this blower, there's the dust cover. That's actually probably reusable. But it's the old style, and these things tend to pop off in operation, so I'm gonna go with the new style they're gonna send us in the kit. Okay, let's have a look in here. Now, since these bearings are in good shape, we're gonna wind up putting these things in a parts washer, washing them out real good because a bunch of shit's gotten into them since we've been pounding on them. But where's my rags at? Paper towels.
Down there.
So we got one kind of bearing here. This is a double row ball bearing, so it's got a lot of axial load resistance. And this one, I believe, is a 2-piece bearing. Comes apart in 2 pieces, if I remember right. Like the inner race can totally come out of the outer race. I can't remember which one's which, but I'll show you once I get all this apart. Let's see what we can have a look in here. Now this bearing is sort of a press fit into this housing, and I'm just making sure that the walls of this housing are relatively clean, so when I start scooching that bearing out, it's not going to scratch it up really bad. So I'm just making sure the inside is fairly clean before I try to get in here and punch this thing out of there. Before I do that, I'm going to pop out this seal. Might be able to get that from the back side. You can use a seal removal tool. Those things look like, I think I got one. See if I can find it. Oh, they got rid of it. Let's go. I think what I'll do is I'll just punch that bearing out of there first. Oh, now it's popping right out. There we go, awesome. Yeah, these ones go in a lot easier. Okay, that one's out. So, much like the other bearing, single row ball bearing with double row ball bearings on the front. And then this one, I believe, is the weird two-piece one. Can't remember how this exactly goes. And okay, so we got the bearing out. Now we got to get that inner seal out of there. So we're just going to punch that through with the punch. We got the seal out, which is mangled now. Now let's work on this bearing here. Yeah, this is the two-piece one. Okay, so this is the side with the two-piece bearing, and I have to take all this apart and get this bearing reassembled essentially. We had one of the pins come out, one of the rollers. They put these flat cylindrical rollers to give them a little more horizontal strength, or sorry, axial strength. Gotta get the cover out of this lip seal. So this is the outer lip seal, and then the bearing end cap is kind of stuck into it, so I'm just going to kind of punch this puppy out of here. By mounting this thing here. Give it some tacks. There we go. Okay. Fucking greasy. So now what's going to happen is all these bearing rollers are going to wind up falling out. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull them out now with a little dental pick tool. I'll just get them to fall out the bottom, and then we'll put them all back together later. Dental tool, dental tool, dental tool. So we'll just dig out all these rollers. Being careful not to scratch up the bearing at all. Wow. Maybe only one of them comes out. Might not have to. Okay, we'll just try to pound this bearing out. Paying real close attention, I don't lose any rollers that fall out. Bearing cage. Put all those in there. Not deformed at all, so that's good. We'll be able to save that. Reuse it. I think, you know, if you were to accidentally destroy any of these bearings, you could get any one of them off of like Granger's website. Just clean the bearings up, have a look at the model numbers, the part numbers, and you'd be able to figure it out pretty good. So now we got the bearing raceway that's still got to come out. This is going to be a little tricky, so I'll just be really careful. Alright, now our blower is fully disassembled. Nice. Cool. So I'm gonna mess around with this bearing, get it all back together. It's gonna take a little while. Just gotta line up all the knobs and then drop the cage in there. It's a pain in the butt. We can talk about all that later. So we'll do another clip here in a minute, but all right guys, we're pretty much done. Thank you. Puller situation installed here. All right. Now we're just gonna drive this rotor out of this house. Rotor one's out. Yeah. Now, if I had some regular old 1/4" bolts that were like that long, I wouldn't have had to hit it with the hammer. I just didn't have any long bolts. So, that's all done. Okay, so this thing's basically done, ready for cleaning, except what we gotta do now is we gotta get the bearings out of the housing, and then we gotta get the seals out. So the way these are real easy to come out, we're gonna dig out the bearings and then dig out the seals. And on this side, it goes seal on the bottom, which kind of protects the inside dirty area from the clean oil on this side. So you got seal and you got bearing. So what we got to do is reach down in here and push that bearing out. Now normally you kind of destroy the bearings when you're taking these things out, but we're going to try to save the bearings and reuse them. Okay, that's good, good. Start filming tweaks and get this done. I got my face for this.
Okay.
Okay. All right, what do we gotta do? We gotta get these shafts out of these bearings. Now, there's an easy way to do this with a 2-jaw puller. There's a couple of slots. What you do is you grab the hooks from your 2-jaw puller, take it out of 3-jaw mode, put it into 2-jaw mode, put these hooks back here, and then you just put your drive nut right here, and you basically just force this shaft out of that bearing by hooking on the housing and then pushing on that shaft like a syringe. I can't find my 2-jaw puller. I think it got lost in the move. So what I'm going to do is use my bar puller, but I can't use that until I get these shafts most of the way out. So what I'm going to do is just mount these shafts put them on this softwood, and then just pound this cover off of those shafts by doing it this way. Once I get these shafts flush with these bearings, then I can put the other puller on there and just push them out the rest of the way. So for now, we're gonna have to do the gangster method, which is hitting it with the big hammer. I'm gonna use a soft mallet because I don't want to mar up this face. I'm just gonna work this cover down, back and forth. What I'm looking for when I'm doing this is not getting that gap too far out of sync with this gap. But I want this cover to go down evenly. So I'm just kind of keeping an eye on that. Yeah, it's going down nice and even. Got the shafts more or less flush, which will allow me to use the puller to push those the rest of the way out. These ones take 1/4-inch holes. Fucking yay. Okay, you can kill that. All right, guys. One last little look here. I got all the parts laid out and organized here. Okay, so this is everything right here. This is what you want to have when you're done. You got the case. It's got all the bolts threaded back in the holes so we don't lose them. We got the gear end and the gear end cover. We got the right gear and left gear, the shaft key, the shims, which actually go behind the spacers, all sitting there, along with the little bearing flange and bolts go behind those gears. We got the idle end cover, or the drive end cover, the feet, both rotors with the little flange screws screwed into the end. We got all 4 bearings, the dust cover. These are for the gear ends. These are, that's the drive shaft bearing, and that is the idle bearing for the backside. And then we got the cover with the little 3/8 plugs, the sight windows, and the 2 grease fittings. That's it. That's everything right there. So what I'm gonna do now is, so the way I've always cleaned these up before is I just get like a angle grinder, put a wire brush on it, and it's tedious. And you're just like grind this shit all back down to bare metal. Don't use a sanding disc, because what'll happen is you'll start taking off metal and then you start screwing with the clearances. You can't do that. What you have to do is get the dirt and the rust off without taking any metal off whatsoever. You gotta clean up all these surfaces with some emery cloth or sandpaper. And yeah, but basically what I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna do that anymore. We've been going through quite a challenge getting this whole operation built up, but what I'm gonna go do is grab a little cheap parts washer that has like a solvent tank, a little pump and a brush, and real good to get all the oil off of this shit. And then I'm also gonna get a little cheap blasting cabinet, get both of those things from Harbor Freight. These are little cheap plastic versions of professional versions of this stuff, but it's good. They're, you know, like 150 bucks each. You can use them a few times before they break, and it'll be a good stepping stone to getting a good professional blast cabinet. But all this stuff's gonna go in the blast cabinet, or most of it. The gears won't go in and stuff like that, but anything that's got rust and grease on it will go in the blast cabinet. It's gonna get blasted with black aluminum oxide, which is basically just rusted aluminum pellets. It's like really abrasive grit. Comes out at high velocity, just takes all this shit right off, gets it right down to bare metal. It doesn't hurt the metal. It's really good. So that'll be the next video, getting this stuff all cleaned up, and then we'll do another one for reassembly and timing. And that's by far the most difficult part, is getting these things put back together and then getting them timed properly. But it's not impossible, and it really only takes a few hours. This whole process could easily be done in one day by one guy, or a good part of a day, but we're gonna break this up over 3 videos just because I don't have a whole day to give to anything at this point. So anyways, all right guys, that's it. We'll see you soon. We'll call this part 1, and we'll see you on the next one. All right, see ya.